In case you missed last week's announcement, you can now support Heavy Hands on Patreon.
If you don't know what Patreon is, it's basically ongoing crowdfunding. Essentially, it's a platform that will allow you, our listeners, to patronize our show in exchange for rewards.
Currently, we have rewards set for monthly pledges of $1, $3, and $5.
You can get your name read on the show or posted on the Heavy Hands website, and you can even get a guaranteed spot in the Heavy Bag, our listener mail segment.
If you'd like to donate more than that per month, we're open to discussing other rewards, including custom scouting work and fight analysis.
We've enjoyed bringing you all the finer points of face punching for the last year, and we look forward to doing so for a long time yet.
Please help us cover our production costs and keep the show running smoothly each and every week. Check out Heavy Hands on Patreon.com. I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined as always by my stalwart co-host, Patrick Wyman. And Pat, we have a stellar show ahead of us, one that I just keep looking at it, and every time I look, it keeps getting better. I keep anticipating it more, which kind of tips me off that I'm going to be disappointed. So I have to tame my expectations. But I'm talking about the next UFC event in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Main evented. In fact, the main event may be the second worst fight on the card.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Main evented by a trilogy, a rubber match between Vitor Belfort and Dan Henderson. Both of them past their primes in different ways. Kind of a depressing number two or number one for most existentially meaningless fight on the card, Pat?
I would say number two, just because it's hard to top Gaston Umalatov versus Viscardi Andrade. Andrade, who hasn't fought in a year and a half, versus Umalatov, whom we wish we had never seen in the first place.
Poor guys, but yeah, that's kind of the way I see it. At least Belfort and Henderson, we know who both of them are. I think it'll be more depressing than Andrade Umalatov.
Oh, no question. I mean, watching deflated dad bod Vitor Belfort get in there with concussed too many times in the past 2 years to count Dan Henderson, like, we don't need that, man. We don't need to see that.
No, and neither do they. They don't need this. At least I would think so. If they do it, it makes it even sadder.
Well, and then we throw on top Vitor Belfort's self-righteous refusal to answer questions about his TRT history. Joanna Prado out there giving bullshit statements to the old Sherdog.com. What a world, man. What a fucking world.
If she doesn't go out there and give bullshit statements, Vitor might not suck on her toes.
That's true.
So,
That's
I mean,
true.
you would do it, right? If that was on the line, you'd be like, yeah, hell yeah, I want Vitor to suck on my toes in a bathtub.
Yeah, I mean, props to Vitor Belfort for getting out there and just sucking Joanna Prado's toes on Brazilian national television.
Props to him.
Props. That is prize fighting in a nutshell right there. It's sucking your future wife's Playboy model toes in a hot tub on Brazilian TV. Like, if that's what made him a star, and by proxy, that's what made Anderson Silva a star. Like, lest we forget, Anderson Silva's superstardom is owed to Vitor Belfort sucking Joanna Prado's toes in a hot tub.
How so? I'm not familiar with this connection.
Okay, so that's how Vitor got famous in Brazil, because Joanna Prado was a well-known TV host and Playboy model in Brazil. So Vitor became famous by marrying her. Mm-hmm. And so Vitor became famous in Brazil and became known widely in Brazil by virtue of Joanna Prado. Anderson Silva only became known broadly by virtue of kicking Vitor Belfort's face off.
Oh.
Because that was one of the first UFC fights to get really big play in Brazil, like really big mainstream media attention in Brazil because of who Vitor Belfort was. So Anderson Silva, who was not well known at all in Brazil at that time, became famous by proxy through Joanna Prado's toes.
Well, thank you, Joanna and Vitor. We owe you so much.
We do indeed.
So much amusement over the past few years. Before we jump in, I should let everybody know, first of all, what we're discussing today. This event is I guess you could say that to some degree it lacks the sort of name value you might expect, but it is the ideal fight night kind of event. It is loaded from top to bottom with meaningful fights between prospects, fringe contenders with lots of promise. It's just, there's basically not a single fight except for the two we just named on the card, one of which has some redeeming value because, names at least. But basically every other fight on this card has something that you should care about these fighters, or you will in the very near future. And so it's really solid. And we're going to talk about prospects all over this card today. Guys like Pedro Munoz, guys like Jimmy Rivera, who Munoz is fighting, like who else are we talking about? Chaz Skelly. We've got Gilbert Burns and Rashid Magomedov. We've got Alex Cowboy Oliveira. We've got Tomas Almeida. We just have like blue chip prospects all over the place here. And so we're going to kind of talk about the nature of prospectism, what we look for when we call a guy a prospect, what kind of improvements we expect to see from each of these fighters. And then some of the guys who are maybe not prospects, despite their age or despite experience, who are kind of finished products, and what kind of changes we expect to see from them, despite the fact that they've really already found their footing. Even guys like Clay Guida, we still see changes, or guys like Gleison Tibau, we still see them changing now so late into their careers. And so we're going to talk about just the nature of development as a fighter. Before we do that, though, I want to thank everybody who contributed to our Patreon page. In case you guys didn't know, and you should have heard because there will be a little announcement at the start of this episode, Heavy Hands is now on Patreon, which is like an ongoing crowdfunding type of service where you can patronize the show in return for rewards. And we are going to be adding rewards for larger contributions. We already got one contribution that was a $10 reward, and later on in the show, I'm going to be thanking everybody personally who qualifies. If you donate $1 to us, you can have your name on the site. $3 or more, and you're going to get thanked here on the show. And for $5, you're going to get a heavy bag question, guaranteed answered, as long as it's something that we feel we can get something out of. And we will give you second chances to come up with something if you struggle to think of a question on your first try. So that's a little incentive for you guys to help support us, and we do appreciate it. Gets us a little something out of this show besides just the general enjoyment we get talking about Joanna Prado's foot and all sorts of other things. That's really the main focus of this show, I think, now. Would you agree, Pat?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
I think future episodes are going to be really, really devoted to just the nature of Brazilian reality TV. But thank you, everybody, for donating. We've already got $60 lined up for this next month, and that's great. It's $60 more than we were making before, and we really can't thank you enough. So please keep contributing, spread the word, tell your friends and everything, and we will continue to appreciate it. So, Pat, fighters on this card, let's start with Pedro Munoz, because I believe Pedro Munoz was on one of your scouting reports a couple years ago, right around the time he came into the UFC, and we were all very worried when he accepted that first UFC fight with Rafael Assunção. He really, really carried himself well despite the loss, and he has only been getting better since then.
Yeah, I think I had Munoz like 8th or 9th on my top 25 list, my Searching for Future Champions list that I did. He trains at Black House. He spent a lot of time training under Rafael Cordero. He's a former no-gi grappling champion, and my coach, who had trained quite a bit with him, said that the first time they wrestled together, he didn't know that Munoz was Brazilian. He mistook Munoz for an American wrestler. That's somebody who had legit collegiate wrestling experience, because that's how good a wrestler he is.
Yeah.
And he's been coming along nicely as a striker, really nicely. He mixes up his elbows, throws really nice punch-kick combination, takes smooth angles. He's very clean, very technical. And he's coming back from a year-long layoff here against Jimmy Rivera. This should be a crackerjack of a fight. Munoz is a really talented guy.
Do we know what the cause of that layoff is?
Yeah, so it's a really strange story. Munoz apparently tested positive for not an elevated testosterone to epitestosterone ratio, for a quote high testosterone level it was something like 900 nanograms per deciliter, which is well within the normal range. But he didn't test positive for any banned substance. He didn't test positive for an elevated testosterone to epitestosterone ratio. And when he tried to appeal to the commission in Nova Scotia, because his last fight was in Halifax, they didn't have a B sample. So he was suspended for a year, couldn't appeal, and the UFC didn't do anything about it. But it's a really strange story.
They just didn't have a B sample?
Yeah, they didn't have a B sample. They never tested a B sample.
That's kind of upsetting.
Yeah, it's a really kind of it's a really kind of a shitty story about what happens when you go to places that don't have good commissions and you're not important enough for the UFC to have your back.
And especially because Munoz, I have very high expectations for Munoz's future as a fighter.
Yeah,
you should have his back. I mean, not that should really matter. Everybody should be stood up for, but like, it's not like he's the kind of guy that you should be like, he's not going to matter, because he already kind of does.
Yeah, he's a future, almost a lock to be a top 10 bantamweight.
Sure, I would agree with that.
Yeah, he's. I mean, he has been training in his time off. I saw him working at Black House. He's healthy. It's not necessarily a bad thing to take a year-long break and heal up some of the things that are bound to have bothered you as a professional face puncher. But he looked good, and he's made consistent improvements. He's gotten better in every single fight, like demonstrably better in every single fight.
Absolutely. Let's talk about that first fight with Rafael Assunção, because Assunção is one of my very favorite fighters. And I have a great deal of respect for Assunção's skill set, and I could not have been more impressed with how Munoz acquitted himself in that performance. Particularly how acutely he picked up on the openings in Assunção's defense, because Assunção is remarkably hard to hit with a clean shot upstairs. He has excellent head defense, particularly when it comes to boxing, and he's a hard counterpuncher, which discourages you from attacking there. Munoz very quickly keyed in on the fact that he was going to be open to leg kicks and punished him over and over and over. Is that one of the kinds of things, sort of the mental acuity or not necessarily killer instinct, but an eye for vulnerabilities? Is that something that stands out to you when you're looking for prospects?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those kind of hard things to kind of pick up on. It's not as easy to point to as this guy throws a lot of strikes, this guy is a clean finisher of a double leg or what have you. But it's a brand of killer instinct and insight. And
Sure.
Munoz absolutely has that. And you can see the same kind of thing in the aplomb with which he goes after submissions in transition, that he can tell when you leave your neck out there to be had. He's got a great guillotine, but he applies the same kind of thing, the same kind of systematic approach to his striking. He's a smart fighter. A lot of different people that I've talked to about him have told me that. He's an intelligent guy who knows how to pick and choose his shots. And he's only gotten better with that.
I recall his fight with Matt Hobar. Excellent shot selection in that fight, and really kind of he reminded me a lot of what we saw shortly after from Rafael dos Anjos. Kind of a sort of relentless, methodical pressure. And I think that speaks volumes about the kind of maturity of Munoz as a fighter, that he hasn't gone to Cordero and gotten overconfident and started to go crazy. But nor was he lacking in confidence enough that a loss to Rafael Assunção would kind of knock him down a peg, because he's only gotten better since then.
And that was his camp's thinking in taking that fight in the first place. That Pedro Munoz was not a guy that the upside for that fight was huge if he somehow managed to win it. But if he lost it, Munoz wasn't the kind of guy who was going to get super down about it. It didn't matter to him that he was undefeated. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Which camp was it who thought that about him, I wonder? Was it Kings MMA or Black House?
Yep, it was Kings. He's not doing as much work. It's kind of a hard situation to describe, but he isn't at Kings very much right now, I don't think, if at all.
Really?
Yeah, they're Cordero had a falling out with the Black House people.
Oh.
Which makes sense, because it's hard not to have a falling out with some of the powers that be at Black House.
Nobody's going to be threatening him with a shotgun anytime soon, I hope.
Yeah, it's the whole thing, man. But at any rate, Munoz is interesting as a prospect because he's experienced. He's not really. This gets at the heart of one of the things that we were going to talk about today. Munoz at this point is not really a prospect. Munoz is into his sixth year as a professional. He's got about 4 years probably before he starts to drop off. Mm-hmm. So what we see from Munoz now, he's not going to be making radical shifts in his game at this point. He's going to continue to make improvements. It's a safe bet. But what you see is more or less what you get. Like, he's not going to be adding whole new skill sets or whole new dimensions to his game.
Sure. He's no longer a prospect. He's a prospect only in the sense that he has yet to prove himself at the elite level, but he's more of kind of a contender to be.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think about it. He's a contender to be. He is a fighter about whom we may not have heard much, but who is clearly on the rise. But he is not a prospect anymore. He's not somebody who's just breaking in.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing to talk about, because I'm interested to know what kind of changes you might like to see, and then maybe versus what changes you would expect to see from a guy like Pedro Munoz at this point. And then throughout the episode, we can contrast that with fighters who do fit the prospect definition more, guys like Corey Anderson, and who else do we have who's really young?
Tomas Almeida is a good example.
Sure,
of that.
Gilbert Burns, who I don't think is super young, but is relatively inexperienced.
Yeah, Burns is still yet to pass the 4th anniversary of being a professional mixed martial artist.
Right, and so we can contrast that. But for Munoz, who I agree, I think stylistically, and that's what I mean. When I say you can see it speaks about the maturity he has. I think he has arrived at a certain understanding with what kind of fighter he's going to be. He knows what he needs to do to win a fight, and he does it very effectively. He fights very maturely, like a guy with experience, which he does have a reasonable amount of at this point. So what kind of changes do you expect, or what kind of changes would you like to see now that he's reached that level?
Well, I think that we're going to see him hitting harder as his mechanics improve, as his fundamentals continue to improve. He's going to he's going to hit harder. You can already see that he was never a puncher prior to that Hobart fight, when he hurt Hobart with strikes on a couple of occasions.
Yeah.
Like, that had never been part of his game. But I think that we're going to see him as his technique gets tighter and better. He's going to get more force behind his shots. I think we'll see that from him. I think especially kicks too. I think he has yet to fully reach his physical potential. I think if we continue to see him now as a 29-year-old on a strength and conditioning program, he's going to be faster, he's going to be stronger, he's going to be bigger. I expect him to improve his physicality. You see guys continue to improve that up into their early 30s. But I think the big thing is more volume, better combinations, better shot placement, all of that. I think he'll just continue to put it together and put his transitions together better. Yeah,
and that's interesting to think about. The style's already there. Pedro Munoz, we don't expect to see him making any radical changes, though we don't want to also risk pigeonholing him and saying, oh, he's this kind of fighter. We know already that a guy to whom I've already compared him, Rafael dos Anjos, is not just a pressure fighter. He's fought fights in recent years where he has shown a level of adaptability. And a smart fighter with thoughtful approach to training can make those changes. I think Munoz is probably one of those guys as well. But he does have a certain comfort with the way of fighting that we've been seeing from him. The kind of methodical, systematic pressure coming forward, stopping takedowns, or shooting for takedowns once he gets your back to the fence, looking for submissions in transition, and hitting you in close before backing up and rinse and repeat. And so, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, and using your aggressiveness against you as well. Like, if you try and shoot a takedown on Pedro Munoz, you're in huge trouble because he's going to submit you.
Yeah.
He's going to get in on your neck. He's going to get your back. He's going to finish you.
Which he did to Gerard Sanders with not the back take, but with the guillotine after stuffing the first takedown that Sanders went for.
Yep. Same way he finished the last guy he fought before he got into the UFC.
Billy Daniels.
Yep, exactly the same thing. He got Daniels' neck in a transition and just choked the life out of it.
And that fight only lasted 2 seconds longer than the Sanders fight.
Yep, exactly. He's lethal like that. But so he fights a guy who's actually fairly similar as a kind of not a prospect, but somebody who this is what we can more or less expect from them in Jimmy Rivera. Rivera's been around a long time. He's been a professional for 7 years, but he's just now starting to put it together. He throws great volume as a boxer. He's got real power in his hands. He's got a strong clinch game. He's a big physical dude. So what stands out to you about this matchup, Connor?
I think we have a battle of inches on our hands here, where we're going to have two guys sort of not necessarily a fight in which both guys are going to be going at each other, because I think what we'll most likely see is Munoz wanting to press forward and Rivera being content to fight off the back foot and to counterpunch, something he's quite good at. Though he is an aggressive counterpuncher. But like when he fought Marcus Brimage, he generally let Brimage come into him before attacking. And I think we'll probably see that here. The thing is I think that Munoz is defensively sound enough, or at least confident enough in what he needs to do to not let that affect him the way it affected Brimage. I think Brimage has kind of a nervousness to him these days. He's been buzzed too many times in fights recently where he really seems like he thinks like he needs to not get hit. And then when he does, it's like he's in deep shit.
Yeah, I think you're right that there's an issue there.
But that's not an issue with Munoz. Munoz is, and maybe I associate this too much with Rafael Cordero, with whom you say he's not doing much training these days. But he definitely has that sort of ingrained confidence that you expect from those Cordero fighters. He has a great deal of comfort with his range, and with he's made his peace with the fact that the other guy is going to try and often succeed to hit him, and it just doesn't bother him. And he's going to use those opportunities whether they land or not.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do fundamentally agree with that. And this seems to me to be the kind of fight where, Munoz, if he were solely content to strike, could easily get himself in trouble with a guy in Rivera who's probably a little more skilled as a striker, has more experience as a striker.
I'd say so.
But I don't think that that's going to happen. What seems likely to me here is that Munoz is going to keep it close to even on the feet, but eventually Rivera is going to make some kind of mistake. Munoz will either take him down or get to a dominant position in a transition, and then find one of those lethal finishes. He's got a great leg lock game.
Mm-hmm.
He's got that great guillotine. He's got a great move to the back. And Rivera is just not that skilled in those aspects of the game.
A little similar to Chaz Skelly, who we'll see later on the card, with that kind of wildly diverse, aggressive submission game. Though I think Munoz is probably a little more polished in that regard.
Oh yeah, Munoz is much more polished. Munoz is a legitimate no-gi grappling champion. He is incredibly skilled in that phase. But Skelly's an interesting guy. So let's talk about him a little bit.
Sure. Chaz Skelly, Team Takedown. We've talked to Stephen Wright on the show several times. We talked about Chaz in the past. An interesting fighter, an odd duck. That's how I would describe Chaz Skelly as a fighter. I'm not sure how Chaz Skelly is getting better. I'm not really, but he seems like he's reached a level of consistent success. I do know he talked about being interested in training more with Dwayne Ludwig, and I'd be interested to see if he's done that for this fight. I tried checking his Instagram and didn't really find any evidence of it. But if he has, I'd love to see a little bit of a different input and see how he continues to develop. But Chaz Skelly is a guy who you would identify him as a prospect based on innate qualities. What you described before we began the show, Pat, as fighting intangibles, striking intangibles in particular, since he is a guy with a grappling background. But as a striker, he's almost always in matchups where the opponent has a chance to outstrike him, and he just refuses to be outstruck. He just won't let it happen. So when he gets hurt, he responds aggressively. It's like he has wooden defense to begin with. And then once he gets hurt because of it, he's like, well, I'm not going to pretend that I have good defense anymore. I'm just going to throw it aside and hammer at you until you go away. His durability and his determination, his confidence in his ability to do that allows him to do it effectively without ever really having to be a great striker fundamentally.
Yeah, he is really long. He's a rangy dude,
yes.
And he uses that in interesting ways as a striker. So he's got really good, I think, proprioception and understanding of space, and I think he sees openings really well. He's got good innate timing, and so he does a really good job of finding half beats and using feints and throwing around and through his opponent's guard, like finding weird ways to score. And he's got pop in his hands too, which makes him threatening. Yeah,
he can crack. He's also sometimes that brawling mentality has gotten him in trouble though.
Yes.
He's had 2 fights in the UFC now where he has landed an illegal knee on someone. In one fight, it possibly cost him the win over another top prospect in
Mirsad
Bektic, who we've talked about on the show before. It may have very well cost him the win. Had he not need Mirsad Bektic against the fence when his hand was down, he might have finished him because Bektic was already hurt, if I'm not mistaken.
He was, yeah. Skelly had stung him with, I think, an overhand or something or an overhand or a knee. Like, I can't remember, but he got him into the clinch. Bektic puts his hand down, and Skelly immediately, like blatantly, it was an obviously illegal
knee,
him
right in the face.
Him in the face. And the knee at the end of the Jim Allers fight, Skelly's
blatantly
last outing,
illegal. Hand and knee on the mat.
Yeah, there was no way that you could possibly think that he wasn't down when he did that. Luckily, I mean, the fight was already over. Allers was done. But
luckily, it was mostly blocked. It may have been a really damaging fight with him as knocked out already as he was.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the answer to me is that Skelly. I think that Skelly's fight IQ sometimes is not awesome, which belies how good the rest of his intangibles are.
Yeah, he's an instinctive fighter, I think, and we have other guys like that. Who's the other example I want to talk about? Maximo Blanco.
Yeah.
right? Like Maximo Blanco just makes horrible decisions all the time, and not the ones we normally think of when we say bad fight IQ. Like his are almost always aggressively bad decisions. It's not like, oh, I'm jumping for a guillotine before I've secured it, or I'm going to pull guard when I'm winning the fight, or I'm going to get dragged into a takedown battle when I've just hurt the guy and spend the next 2 minutes of the round exhausting myself on a takedown I'm not going to get instead of finishing him. It's like just landing fouls because you just so desperately want to hurt the other guy. That's what the mentality you see from a guy like Skelly too. It's like this sort of brawler's determination to hurt the opponent and to press the advantage when he is hurt, and it gets him into trouble. He lacks a certain discipline, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. But which is interesting because Skelly's grappling game is very disciplined.
Yes.
He's playing the grappling game that Skelly's playing, and Skelly is primarily a grappler. He's gotten better as a striker, much better, but he is still essentially a wrestle grappler. That's more or less his approach. But he plays that game in interesting ways that fit the kind of broader metagame in interesting ways. So what he does is he will take you down, generally from the clinch. He doesn't have great shot takedowns. He takes you down, and then he kind of lets you move under him, and he lets you scramble to the point where. Or get back to your feet to the point where you give up your back, and then the second that you give up your back, Skelly grabs it. Skelly has an outstanding series, not just one move, an outstanding series of back takes from various positions that all come when he allows you to move under him and expose your back so that he can grab it.
He's very much like Cain Velasquez plus submissions in that regard, where he'll let his opponent maneuver around him, where Velasquez will use this to find openings for strikes while the opponent is trying to stand up. Skelly uses it to find mostly avenues to the back. Is he a disciplined grappler, though? Because when I think of it, he's a very fundamentally sound grappler. He does everything very correctly, so his mechanics are very good, which isn't the case on the feet. But he's still hyper-aggressive as a grappler, in the same way that he is in the stand-up. He really has no problem getting into scrambles that might be 50-50 were it not for his great instincts and for his technical ability. He will get into a prolonged leg lock battle with a fighter and just look to sweep them and stay on his back. And it's not like he doesn't hang out in bad positions. He's always going. So he's got this style that allows a guy to fight wherever, from his back or wherever on the ground. But is it necessarily a disciplined approach? Is there a metagame to it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the metagame is exactly what I was pointing to. That Skelly, by letting you move, is letting you think that you have these openings, that you have these places to go. By letting you scramble, he's letting you think that you have opportunities, and really you don't. Like those, obviously there is an element of risk to those, but you can be disciplined and still take risks. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that a little later with Tomas Almeida. But being disciplined does not necessarily mean fighting in a risk-free fashion.
Sure. Okay.
You can be undisciplined and try and fight in ways that minimize your risk.
Okay. Well, we'll get to discuss this a little more. We've got a couple other fighters with interesting questions of discipline to their game. With that being said, we'll take our first break now. And when we come back, who do you think's next up on the docket, Pat?
I think we should talk a little bit about Corey Anderson.
Let's do it. Why not? When we come back, we'll talk about Corey Anderson and then move on to our other prospects and our other guys who maybe seem like prospects but aren't after this. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us. And like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. And we are back. Pat, you wanted to talk about Corey Anderson, who is fighting this weekend's card. Corey is fighting Fabio Maldonado, who just everybody loves, and also who he's 35. Mm-hmm. I was literally just on the cusp of saying he won't be fighting long. He's 35 years old, and he's had 22 boxing matches as well.
Yeah. I have the best Fabio Maldonado story that I cannot tell on the air, but that I will tell you the next time we go to break.
It's going to have to be a Patreon reward. If you donate $100 a month to the show for 6 months straight, then you get to hear the Maldonado story.
Yeah, we could turn it into a Patreon reward.
Let's monetize that story.
Oh God, yeah. But so Corey Anderson, I love Corey Anderson because Corey Anderson is the closest thing to a real blue chip prospect that the thin as hell light heavyweight division has.
Sure.
He's a legitimate wrestler. He's got a great wrestling background, and he is before our very eyes turning into an excellent striker to be.
Yeah.
He trains under Mark Henry, who's Frankie Edgar's boxing coach, and you can see the results, the improvements in every fight.
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about some of the things we saw in that Blachowicz fight. Some of the things that have developed in Anderson's game more recently, because of course his first big UFC break was the fight with. He had the Justin Jones fight, but the one I remember him for is the John Vellante fight, which kind of showed some of the holes in his game, right? Where he fought a very game fight against John Vellante, but ultimately got knocked out and ate about 1,000 leg kicks en route to getting knocked out, and had a very rough time. If he did also at the same time acquit himself pretty well against a relatively tough, much more experienced fighter. Since then, just from that time to the Blachowicz fight, I think we saw a lot of improvements out of Anderson. Notably, I think we saw a lot more cognizance when it comes to movement, footwork with purpose, rather than just doing things to do things. Because already in the Vellante fight, we saw more striking volume from him, and how just volume at the cost of all else allowed him to stay in that fight till the third round by just being an issue. Like, if Vellante was close enough to him to be hit, things were going to be coming at him, and that made him an issue. Now we saw that same thing blended with a little more thoughtful lateral movement and footwork in the Blachowicz bout.
Yeah, and I think that you can see those kinds of improvements in general through the mirror of Frankie Edgar, too.
Sure.
That given that they're training partners, I think that there is a lot less movement in Mark Henry's system for the sake of movement than there was a few years ago. I think that Edgar's movement has become more purposeful over time. Anderson's movement has become more purposeful in a much shorter period of time. Well, it's almost like Mark Henry has gotten better at teaching movement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like maybe there's it strikes me as a kind of thing where you would just kind of change the way you phrased something. Mm-hmm. Where instead of, like, a lot of coaches will just say, oh, stay on your toes, footwork, without saying anything specific. And so then guys will bounce a lot and move a lot, and they want to please their coaches, so they'll do something that looks like footwork, but isn't really purposeful. And so now we see from these guys that they're taking angles deliberately, that they're moving side to side to make themselves more difficult targets, or to force their opponents to reset, or to open up the other guy's stance, which leaves them open to strikes or takedown attempts.
Yeah, and you can see that with the way that Anderson was changing angles against Blachowicz, who's pretty flat-footed and fairly plodding. Mm-hmm. So that kind of movement against him was hard for Blachowicz to deal with, because Anderson, who's a much faster, much rangier, much more explosive fighter, he could get Blachowicz moving, change directions, and then come in with 3 punches and a kick.
Yeah, and
there was just no way for Blachowicz to keep up with that output of strikes and with that kind of movement, because Blachowicz had no way of dealing with it. He tried to use kicks to cut off Anderson's movement, but Anderson had improved in defending those kicks. He still ate a few too many for my liking in the first round of that fight, but was clearly better. And it was hard for me not to see in the Vellante fight the shades of Edgar getting his legs kicked out from underneath him by Jose Aldo. When you're moving for the sake of moving, a really good leg kicker is going to sense the moment when you put your weight down on your leg and then kick the hell out of it.
Yeah.
And Vellante, for all of his flaws, is an accomplished leg kicker.
Yeah, he's a very powerful leg kicker, and he's got great timing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I the other thing, let's see, we've talked about Mark Henry's tactics with Edson Barboza and Frankie Edgar in the past. We've talked about how he has a tendency to produce what we call on this show rote strikers, kind of teaching things in sequences, not necessarily teaching concepts so much as teaching orders of moves. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. I think Floyd Mayweather learns things systematically kind of that way. A lot of very good fighters learn things where it's like this move comes after this move. And then, of course, you can improvise within that system. But it's a certain type of approach. But I think from Anderson, what we saw is the positive of that kind of training, which is that he was throwing he knew what punches went after what punches or what kicks came after what punches, and he would throw those with a very clear sort of metagame purpose in mind, with a strategic goal. So I'm thinking, for example, I'm watching right now, we've got the second round of Anderson versus Blachowicz, and Anderson is using a lot of lateral movement. Blachowicz is trying to cut him off and figure it out, and Blachowicz decides, all right, I need to get this guy to the fence. So he comes forward with like a 5-punch combination. An overhand right, then he comes in with an uppercut to work off of that, followed by a jab right hand, just to get Blachowicz back into the fence so he can attack a single leg and put him on the mat. And that's not something we used to see from him before. In the Vellante fight, for example, he was really just trying to strike with Vellante. Now it's a lot less, I need to hit the guy with these punches, because none of these are particularly good, clean punches. But there's more of a thoughtful approach behind it, where even if I can't hit this guy, and Jan Blachowicz is not necessarily easy to hit on the feet. He's quite an experienced kickboxer himself. But the thought process is, even if I can't hit him cleanly or beat him with my striking, I can put him where I want him to go. I can move him the direction I want him to move. I can open him to the thing that I really want.
Yeah, and in kind of a broader sense, it's really encouraging to see those kinds of developments from Anderson.
Yeah.
Because he's a guy who has not been in the game for all that long. He is a prospect versus a guy he's a prospect as opposed to a guy like Rivera or Munoz who has more experience, who they're kind of becoming, they're more or less who they're going to be plus some improvements. Anderson is still making massive leaps and bounds in every single fight. He has so much upside that we can expect to see him get a lot better.
Munoz, Rivera, those guys are refining. They are sharpening. And he is, where Anderson is still being shaped. He's still being sculpted from the rough stone.
Yep.
And absolutely. And he's always like, he's already a prospect because he's athletic, obviously athletic. He's relatively strong. He's pretty quick. He's got great stamina. He can go and go and go. And he used to waste a lot of movement and just go and go regardless. But now he is showing what we talked about before, that kind of the mental acuity to see the openings where they are, the sort of maturity that you want to see develop in a prospect to know whether or not he's going to remain a fringe contender or if he has, serious aspirations to become a top 10 fighter.
Yeah, exactly. So, to kind of continue playing, I think both of us are pretty convinced he's going to just smash Fabio Maldonado, right?
Yeah. He's got all the options, right? Mm-hmm. He might take some shots on the feet. Never count Fabio Maldonado out when it comes to his ability to absorb punishment and look like the Joker with just blood leaking out of every portion of his mouth and just keep going, but also never count Fabio Maldonado in when it comes to learning how to grapple.
Also true. The best description of Fabio Maldonado I've ever heard is a, quote, cool bus driver. Does that not sound right, though? Does he not look like the kind of dude who's wearing in like out of a 1950s or 1960s movie who's driving a Greyhound cross country wearing a funny little hat?
A cool bus driver.
Yep, that is courtesy of friend of the show at Swarthy Villain on Twitter.
Oh my god!
That is I believe the exact phrase he used to describe John Vellante when Maldonado beat him was, quote, nuked by a cool bus driver. So I wanted to shout back out to that one because it was outstanding.
I don't even know why. I don't even know why I enjoyed that so much. It's so apt, and I can't tell you exactly why.
Yeah, it's literally perfect.
A cool bus driver.
Before we fall down the bus driver trap, the next fight features a matchup of a prospect versus a guy who's in the process of refining. In Gilbert Burns versus Rashid Magomedov, I think this is the best fight on the card.
Oh yeah.
In terms of the implications for both guys, the kind of quality of the matchup, just an outstanding fight.
I've been having daydreams about this fight since they announced it months ago, and when I saw that this is the card that it was going to be on, because I already knew it was coming up, but I didn't know when it was exactly. I let out a girlish squeal because I've been anticipating this fight so much. Rashid Magomedov is one of my favorite fighters in MMA right now. Love watching him fight. Gilbert Burns has huge potential, and we've got a really compelling, kind of in the same way that the Chaz Skelly Kevin Souza fight is, a really compelling matchup of very conflicting goals. You know?
Yeah, they're very Burns and Magomedov are very different fighters. It should go without saying. So Magomedov is much more experienced. Magomedov's been a professional for 7 years. He's still getting better, getting demonstrably better from fight to fight. But Burns is the kind of guy who's got tremendous athletic potential. He's made dramatic strides in a brief period of time. He's a physical specimen. He's big. He's athletic. He's explosive. A lot to like about his game. But so who do you favor in this, kind of off the top of your head, Connor?
Top of my head, it's got to be Magomedov. And I think it's a difficult matchup for Burns. There is an essential irony to Gilbert Burns. He's a member of the Black Zillions team, and specifically under the wing of Vitor Belfort. And when I think of the Black Zillions, I think, guys like Abel Trujillo, who's also on this card, guys like Anthony Johnson. I think of guys who are very dangerous, very confident strikers who panic and lose their composure on the ground and get finished. And Gilbert Burns is the exact opposite, right? Gilbert Burns is Cool Hand Luke on the ground. He has absolutely no issue finding these little openings for chokes and quick back takes, and he's a great guard player, which is a very difficult thing to be in modern MMA. And then on the feet, he just seems to have no confidence when he's against an opponent who can really test him.
Yeah, the confidence in Burns' case comes from the fact that he's I think a 4-time World Jiu-Jitsu champion,
yeah,
and also a no-gi champion. He tried to compete, I think, at this year's ADCCs. He is an exceptionally talented grappler.
Second-degree black belt.
Yeah, he is as legit as you can possibly get in the UFC as a grappler. So he has that confidence. But I think that you're right about him on the feet. It's easy to be, I think, overly critical of Burns' striking simply because when you see how technical he looks, kind of at first glance, it's easy to forget that he doesn't have that much experience at it.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't take a ton to shake his confidence in it. Does that make sense?
No, that absolutely makes sense. I think we're probably both thinking of his last fight against Alex Oliveira, Cowboy Oliveira.
Yeah, he reminds me. I think it's interesting that we're discussing him right after talking about Corey Anderson, because it's a similar kind of thing where it's easy that, like, Anderson looked, like he knew what he was doing on his feet against Jean Vellante. He looked like he knew what he was doing, and Burns in the first few minutes of his fight against Oliveira looked like he knew what he was doing. Because they've got their hands in the right place, they're moving in a way that's suggestive of them having some measure of skill. They're throwing shots in combination, which makes you think like, oh yeah, okay, this guy knows how to strike. Then something happens, and you realize, oh no, they're pretty inexperienced. This is all new to them.
It's kind of the same effect of watching a guy who wants to be a striker, and you see him against bad grapplers, and he sprawls brilliantly on takedowns. You're like, he's got takedown defense. And then you see him fight a guy who has more than one way to finish a takedown. And you're like, oh, he doesn't know what he's doing, really. He hasn't been doing it long enough to have that. So I guess I could describe Gilbert Burns' striking as shallow. He does a lot of the right.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, he does a lot of the right things, but there's just no depth to it yet. He doesn't have the confidence to know where to go when a certain thing stops working. So Gilbert Burns will throw a very nice jab. He'll throw a very nice inside leg kick. He'll put together a good combination, but something will be a little off about these sometimes. Maybe he'll throw a hook when he's far too far away for it to land. And you're like, I'm not sure if that was the right time for that, but it's okay because his jab is still going and he's still moving. He's light on his feet, and then he'll throw a kick and it restores your confidence. And then somebody attacks him and he covers up and waits for them to stop. And you're like, he's not as good as I thought he was. And then you see Alex Oliveira countering him. And with every counter that Cowboy Oliveira landed, Gilbert Burns was just covering up more and waiting more and just hoping for Oliveira to go away so he could get back to a place where he was comfortable. He wasn't comfortable in the reality of a striking battle.
Yeah, exactly. And if there is a place where Rashid Magomedov excels, I bet you watch Gilbert Burns hit the pads, and I've seen video of Gilbert Burns hitting the pads, and it is gorgeous. It is a thing of beauty.
Sure.
I bet you watch Rashid Magomedov hitting pads, may not look quite as pretty, but Rashid Magomedov is a master of sports in boxing. He's a master of sports in hand-to-hand combat. And when you get titles like Master of Sports in Russia, those can only come through competition.
Yeah.
You cannot get those through demonstration or because you've put the time in. You only get those things through competition.
Yeah.
Because you have accomplished things in organized sports. So Rashid Magomedov has been in there. He knows what he's doing. This will be his 20th professional fight as a mixed martial artist. God knows how many amateur boxing matches and amateur striking matches under other rule sets he's had. He is an incredibly organic striker. He sees the openings. He sees what you're doing as it happens, and he responds accordingly. He is the opposite of a rote striker.
That's exactly how I would describe him. And that's why, to me, I love watching Magomedov so much because he's one of those guys where there's just a visible thought process going on. Mm-hmm. You can watch Magomedov, and this is the kind of thing, I think a lot of people hear descriptions like this, and it sounds like snobbery, where I'm like, oh, this is my pick for fight of the night. Magomedov's fighting. Now, he might not be exciting, and then they're like, okay, he's just, he's picking a guy who's technical or whatever. I want to watch somebody who's fun to watch. If you really sit down and try to appreciate what Magomedov does, though, there's just he's a very deliberate, very tactical fighter, and unfortunately for Gilbert Burns, who showed that he will not stop trying to finish when he overcame those first 2 rounds against Cowboy Oliveira to get a 3rd-round submission, unfortunately for him, that means Magomedov only gets better as fights go on. He becomes more dangerous. Once he learns your openings, he starts finding more and more ways to exploit them. He had a very difficult first round in his UFC debut against Tony Martin. He got caught in a brutal Kimura, which turned into an even more brutal armbar, and he had to tough his way out before escaping it. Come the 2nd round of the fight, or the beginning of the 3rd round of the fight, and it looked like the exact opposite. He's just there. Martin's clinching with him. Suddenly he can't get him down. Now Magomedov has found a way to stop his takedowns. He's hitting him with knees while he's there. He takes Tony Martin down. Tony Martin stands up like, all right, well, at least I'm in my range. And Magomedov kicks him in the face as soon as he stands up. Everything just starts to build on what he's learned in the previous rounds. And so he's just this beautiful sort of constantly evolving work of art when he's fighting with a lot of precision, not necessarily hugely dangerous, but he gets more dangerous as the fight progresses. I think he's going to be a really tough matchup for Burns, unless Burns can really drag him down and be really aggressive and submit him in the first round. And Magomedov's never been submitted either. He's not a bad submission grappler, in fact. Yeah,
he has really, really tremendous takedown defense.
Yes.
Really awesome takedown defense.
92% in the UFC.
Yeah, he's been taken down exactly once in the UFC. That was by Tony Martin in his debut, and Tony Martin is a guy who weighs in the cage probably 185 or 190 pounds.
He looked about 2 weight classes bigger than Magomedov, who is a pretty small lightweight, I think.
Yeah, I think Magomedov would not have a ton of trouble making featherweight if he tried.
Yeah.
But in Magomedov's case, I think he's the kind of guy, if we're talking about refinements, if we're talking about kind of the broader course of a fighter's career, Magomedov is going to be a guy who gets more dangerous as he ages.
Yeah.
Because he's going to see those openings more clearly and have more tools in his bag for exploiting the openings as he sees them. And you can see that now. He went through a long run where he had nothing but decisions, basically.
Yeah.
Because, he was focusing on work rate and output and being clean and being technical and finding his counters. And as his counters get sharper, as his shot selection gets sharper, as he sees things more clearly, you could see at the end of that fight with Elias Silverio, he was on it. He knew that he had it.
Yeah. And since coming to UFC, I think you could probably say in all 3 of his UFC fights, he has almost finished all of those opponents.
Yep.
And effortlessly. That's the thing with Magomedov. He has not desperately sought the finishes. And while that may speak to a certain lack of killer instinct, I just think it kind of tells you how clinical he is as a fighter. He has effortlessly hurt every fighter that he has faced in the UFC so far, and they have slowly gotten better and or more experienced as he's gone along. And Gilbert Burns is the least experienced yet, but certainly one of the ones with the most talent, and I really think people are going to be disappointed to see. Hopefully Gilbert Burns can come back from this, because I'm really having a difficult time seeing how he wins this fight.
Yeah, it's one of those fights. It's strange. You'll rarely hear me say this, but I'm surprised that the betting odds are as close as they are. This strikes me. I think Magomedov is about a -160 favorite. Yeah. I would peg him as at least 2-1 in this fight. So if we're got to finish this, I think he takes a fairly easy decision and maybe knocks him out.
Yeah, maybe late in the fight. He's got a great counter left hook. His left body kick, especially for a guy with a boxing background, he's an excellent, accurate, punishing kicker.
and he counter kicks too.
Yeah,
which we rarely see. He will throw kicks not only as like counters, as like full beat counters in sequence, but also he will throw counter, like same time counter kicks.
Yeah,
which is a really rare skill. You rarely see that.
Well, it shows you how confident he is in his range, where he'll feel like he can take a slight step back slide just out of range of your right hand and then catch you on the liver while your elbow's away from your body, without getting hit with the cross.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Gotta finish up this discussion with if you think that the crowd might worry Rashid Magomedov, the Brazilian crowd. This is a quote from after his fight against Rodrigo Dom.
Yeah.
The crowd here is really loud with the vai morrer, but one day we're all going to die, so it didn't bother me. Is that not the baddest thing you've ever heard in your life?
Ooh, cheers to Rashid Magomedov. Hey, vai morrer too. Have a good night. That's it.
What a man.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, Rashid Magomedov. And don't worry if they boo you, because goddamn, you're a pleasure to watch fight. So I'm really looking forward to that one. When we come back, we got a couple more guys to discuss. We've got a heavy bag question from our first round of donors, and then we'll have some words of advice on how to get in touch with us with those questions if you are one of the many people who donated $5 or more, pledged, I should say, $5 or more to the podcast. So we'll take a break, and then we'll come back. A couple more fighters to talk about, and then our heavy bag questions for the end of the show. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we are back. The final fight we want to discuss tonight, both fighters sort of a prospect status, maybe questionable to some degree, and we'll get into that, is Tomas Almeida and Anthony Birchak. Let's do a quick pick for this fight before we discuss it, Pat.
I like Almeida here. I think that I think and have thought for a very long time that he is something truly, truly special.
Yeah.
He is a god of violence, and I think he's got 18 finishes in 19 fights. He's still undefeated. I think he gets another finish here.
I think so too. And I do think that Anthony Birchak is a dangerous guy. I think he's a remarkably dangerous fighter, in fact, and a very game opponent. But I just think that Tomas Almeida has more to offer. It's almost one of those things where I think, yes, I could see Birchak winning. Brad Pickett, for all that his nickname is One Punch, is not a massive puncher, and he really did hurt Almeida in their fight. And if he could do that, then Anthony Birchak definitely could too.
Yeah, Birchak this is a great matchup. This is Sean Shelby just showering us with a present from the heavens right here.
Yeah.
Because these are both pathologically aggressive and incredibly dangerous guys. The difference is that Birchak is probably a little more athletic, probably hits a little harder punch for punch, but Almeida is miles more technical as a striker.
Yeah, and different mindsets, I think, despite their aggressiveness. Yeah. I think Almeida's more like a boxer, puncher, pressure fighter kind of style. He wants to be in the pocket. He wants to counter you. He wants to be close enough that he's always threatening you. Birchak is really like a brawler to me.
Yeah,
and not like a completely untechnical one. And it's a good thing because he's got that brawler's instinct. In the same way that Chaz Skelly does, sometimes gets him into trouble. But, for example, the combination with which he finished Joe Soto. Just beautiful transitional fighting. There's no reason that Joe Soto would have ever trained for the strike that put him down. Because he got hit, he wrapped up a clinch with Birchak, and then Birchak threw a knee, and Joe Soto stood up, and before Birchak was able to even put his foot down, he just donked Soto on the chin with a short right hand, and it knocked him out. It was an odd combination. He was just hitting what was there. He's a very natural striker in that sense, and that makes him risky. But Almeida, he has similar instincts while also being much more technical. He throws almost always in combination. He has vicious low kicks. He's a great body puncher. I think even though he's not a great defensive fighter, he's a little more adaptable than Birchak in a defensive sense, where he knows what to respect. Birchak kind of doesn't know what can hurt him.
Yeah, I buy that. I think that as somebody who has watched Almeida for a really long time, like I've watched him going all the way back to his fights in Legacy, like his early fights in Legacy in like 2013. I've watched him for a long time. He is hittable early. Like if you want to hurt Tomas Almeida, you've got to do it in about the first 2 or 3 minutes of the fight, because after that he figures out what you're going to do, and his defense becomes not airtight because he likes to operate in the pocket. He is always going to be there to be hit.
Yeah.
But his defense becomes layered after the first few minutes of the fight. Early on, he either tries to move his head, or he tries to block your punches, or he tries to parry your punches. After about 3 minutes, when he settles in and he gets your rhythm and he gets your distance, then he starts to put all those things together, and it becomes very difficult to hit him cleanly repeatedly.
Yeah.
He's always going to get hit an above average number of times in absolute terms, but percentage-wise, after the early going, he's very hard to hit with a lot of shots put together, at least while he's hitting you back with more harder shots.
And that's the key, I think. I think that Almeida has a great, whether it's instinct or whether he's been trained very acutely as a counterpuncher, he responds very well offensively, which helps to bolster his defense. He will basically spend the first few minutes of the fight kind of learning what he really needs to avoid, or what he needs to punish you actively for throwing to get you to stop. And then as the fight progresses, he gets better and better at doing that. I think the fight with Brad Pickett's a perfect example of that. Almeida got badly hurt early, I think by a Pickett left hook.
It was a left hook both times. Both times he got hurt.
He was floored twice, but even in that same round, he floored Pickett with a right elbow, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was an overhand. It was like an overhand counter elbow, like a cross counter elbow.
Yeah, and then finished him off with a flying knee in the second round. And not a silly flying knee, like a very tactically thrown, the way that Pat Curran used to throw his flying knees, really well timed, got the right distance, controlled the head of Pickett as he threw it. He really started to put the pieces together. He understood his distance. He started to roll under or block the left hook whenever Pickett threw it, and then to counter it with his own left hook, or to come over with the right elbow and the right hand to keep Pickett's left hand at home. He felt like he had to block. And if he wasn't, he was getting hurt. And I think that, again, we look for when we talk about these prospects, I think, is not just athletic ability, right? We would talk about Birchak as like a phenomenal top prospect if we were talking about just how dangerous they are, how fast they are, how hard they hit, or whatever. But we also want to see really mean fighters who that's what they have, or really powerful fighters. Those are rarely champions. Guys who rely on that alone. You know, in boxing we have like our Ernie Shavers. Ernie Shavers was the hardest hitter probably in boxing history. He was never, ever, ever going to beat Muhammad Ali, because it takes a lot more than just having that one thing that you do really well against guys at your level to be a champion. And so when we look at a guy like Tomas Almeida, we see that level of maturity, that level of he looks experienced before his time, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and he has a background. He has a background in Muay Thai before he ever started fighting in MMA.
Yeah,
he's got and he's extremely well trained. He's trained by Diego Lima, who is a student of Luis Azeredo, who is a student of Rafael Cordero. It's a kind of a different branch of the Chute box lineage, but it's one that's much more inflected with boxing and Dutch style kickboxing than the main Chute box lineage. It's much more refined. It's much more focused around combinations, and Almeida is its finest practitioner.
Yeah,
I really think that he's something special, and he's the kind of fighter in my mind who, you know, we always talk about styles making fights and matchups, and you know, I don't really see anybody at the top of the bantamweight division like beating TJ Dillashaw in the near future. Like, I think he'll probably beat Dominic Cruz. But I think that Tomas Almeida would be a really interesting matchup for TJ Dillashaw.
And only 24. He's only 24 years old.
Yeah, he's so in the vein that we wbut talking about before with, you know, Birchak has been fighting as a professional for like 6.5, 7 years. Birchak is essentially the dude he's going to be. But Almeida who's only been fighting for like 4 years as a professional and is only 24. Almeida still has a ton of room to add full-on dimensions to his game. He's still not a finished product physically either. He's getting bigger and stronger, and he's becoming an even harder puncher. Like, he still has room to transform himself.
And that's pretty frightening considering how complete he already looks. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of room for growth there for Anthony Birchak. Well, with that, having discussed that fight, we both think Almeida's going to win, probably pretty early, right?
I think it's going to take him a while. Actually, I think it's going to take him into the third round. I think he's going to get touched up early. I think he's going to get touched up in the first. I think he'll come on by the end of the first round. Second round is going to be Almeida, but I think it's going to take him into the third to really swarm and put a finish on Birchak, who's a tough dude. Birchak is real tough.
That's true.
He's eaten big shots before.
I kind of think I see a second round finish. I think while Birchak is definitely tough, he's also very, very hittable.
He is. This is true.
And Almeida does know how to hit. We have a heavy bag question though, Pat. I got to play our lovely sound effect here. I'm going to make the cardinal sin of announcing the sound effect before I play it too. And this is one of our very first heavy bag questions from our Patreon page. And to let you listening at home know what that is, if you pledge $5 or more a month to the show, you basically get a guaranteed spot in the heavy bag. You can send us a message via Patreon, and we will answer your question, provided it is about the finer points of face punching, as it were, something about the actual practice, the training, the strategy of mixed martial arts or boxing or combat sports in general. And if it's a question we don't feel like we can have an insightful answer for, or one that we don't feel fits the criteria, we'll ask you for another one, and we'll give you a couple chances. And you can do it what this fellow who sent us this question did, and give us a few options, and that way we can definitely have one to go for from the get-go. So this comes from Emil Rainberg, who sent us a couple of questions, and we're going to answer this one. He asks, how do you feel about kicks to the knees, by which I believe he means stomp kicks, oblique kicks, side kicks? Are they essentially soft banned? Should more fighters use them? In my opinion, Emil says, as long as they are legal, they pose a valid threat. What do you think, Pat?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, we have to clarify that these kicks are not really to the knee. You either throw them just below the knee or you throw them just above the knee,
sure.
Or to kind of the thigh, the front of the thigh in general. You don't want to land them to the knee because if you do, you're going to break your foot.
Sure.
Like I have fractured my heel bone trying to throw a teep to the thigh. The guy lifted his knee to check. My heel went off his kneecap. Your heel or your foot is going to lose that battle every freaking time. Like it just is. They're softer bones. They're more of them. They're smaller. Like those bones are going to break before the kneecap does. So really, that's the area you're throwing it to. I think that there's nothing wrong with them. I think that those kicks are great. I can see why they worry people, but I think that the fears are kind of overblown.
Yeah. And typically you target the shin or the thigh, just to clarify this. And we have we have a couple varieties of what you might consider knee kicks or knee stomps. There are a couple, basically all of them John Jones does. He'll do the purring kick, which is often to the shin. From this mostly known as a savate kick, and that's where you'll basically bring your foot straight off the ground, often your rear foot, and turn the toes outward and kind of do a soft stomp to the shin of the opponent to stop their forward momentum. He'll do the side kick, usually off the lead leg, where he will stomp downward on the thigh, right above the knee. Does he do any others? He does the purring. He does a purring kick both to the knee and to the thigh, I think.
Yeah, I mean there are a lot of variations on it.
Does he ever teep the leg?
He doesn't really teep the leg, but that's not something we see all that much in MMA. For better and worse reasons.
Sure. But all of them, the thing is, we've certainly heard complaints from Quentin Jackson, having fought Jones and complaining that Jones ruined his knee. You can measure the veracity of those claims colored by what you think of Rampage Jackson. But nobody else has really been injured that I know of in a major fight from that kick or from kicks of that type. I can't really think of any notable examples.
Well, and I think in Rampage's case, just to dig into this a little bit, like Rampage was a dude who at that point was, I want to say 34 with 12 years of experience under his belt. Like his knees were probably not in awesome shape to start with.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, I mean, I understand his concern there, but I think it's a little weird in a sport that involves some pretty crazy head trauma to be real worried about that. I mean, I throw those kind of kicks in sparring. I've been hit with those kind of kicks in sparring. Like, it's a different. I think, actually, let me explore this a little bit with you, Connor. I think it's a different kind of impact than guys are used to, and I think that kind of fear of the uncommon impact puts guys off. That you're not used to being kicked in the front of the thigh.
Sure.
It's like, you know, you when you think about it, the first time you get actual low kick, like shin to thigh, it's a pretty shocking experience. But you get used to it after a while because it happens to you. You don't get kicked in the front of the thigh very often. It's kind of a jarring thing. You never develop a familiarity with that particular brand of impact.
Yeah, it's a thing. I mean, for example, you can get very used to pretty quickly bracing for body shots, to the point where unless it's a perfectly targeted body blow, you're not going to feel it, really. If you just tense your muscles in your stomach, it just kind of slides off, and you don't notice it too much. That's not the case, probably not without great experience for a kick to the leg. I agree. It feels very different. On the flip side, though, it's very difficult to generate enough leverage and to get the leg to stay still long enough to actually badly hyperextend the knee, in my experience. It's very difficult because the leg wants to move. And typically when you stand, unless you have very bad form, your lead leg is never going to be straight, ever. And so the moment it gets kicked, it already has a bit of motion to go before it straightens out. And really, once it gets kicked, it shouldn't straighten out that badly. We've seen it a couple times, particularly when it's been thrown as a counter. There was one nasty one that landed on Keith Jardine, and I remember who threw that back in the day, where he got hit while he was throwing a cross, and his weight was all committed on that leg. Badly hyperextended. I wish I could remember what fight that was.
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people's worries, I think that they worry too much about the hyperextending the knee part, and they confuse hyperextension with just getting kicked in the kind of vulnerable tendons around your knee.
Sure.
Those are worrisome. Those are worrisome things, but you're not used to getting hit there again, and so I think that's a lot of it.
It was Brandon Vera, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
Who stomped right down on Keith's knee as he was planting his foot to basically come in and throw a leaping left hook. And it does look pretty grisly. But I don't recall Keith being injured by it.
No, I mean, you know, you're probably going to be out for a little while, but like that's true of a lot of things.
Yeah, I just can't really get myself worked up about it. When I know guys are getting badly concussed and, you know, like you just have to... I think it's like Anderson's leg breaking, where people are like, oh, this is the worst thing we've ever seen. Like, he got knocked out in the fight before that. That's way worse. You know what I mean? Like, he could stop fighting and never, ever experience really the effects of that broken leg again as long as it was set properly. Yeah, but he could very well be experiencing the effects of the knockout that Chris Weidman handed him for years and years to come, whether or not he quits. I guess it's just less flashy. Like, concussions don't stand out. They don't look gross. So it's like, you know, they happen, but it's easy to ignore. I think that if you're going to get upset about kicks to the leg, really, and consider calling them a soft ban or say they're unsportsmanlike, you really have to consider how much thought you've given being a fight fan. Because there is an essential kind of... there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, maybe, to being a fight fan. And you have to, in some way, come to terms with the fact that you're watching bad things happen to people. And you have to not necessarily even justify it, but just accept that you're going to see some things that are going to make you uncomfortable, and that's just the nature of the sport. And I don't really see knee kicks as being any worse than any of the many other terrible things that happen to fighters. I don't even see them being worse than like a heel hook. Not at all. I've seen a lot of injuries from heel hooks. I've never seen an injury from this kick, so I just struggle to really get ired, to work up the ire and complain about it.
Yep, I'm there with you.
It is what it is. So thank you, Emil, for your question. Thank you very much for your contribution. We will be giving everyone basically, and we'll probably try and do a rolling thing where you can get one guaranteed question for 6 months or for a year, and then if you pledge again, $5 or more, we'll give you another question. I assume at some point we'll work up a backlog. We've already got, I think, 10 people who've donated $5 or more. So we got 10 questions we need to get through in the coming week's episodes. So please be patient with those, but thank you again for supporting the show. We're very excited to be on Patreon. We're very excited that so many of you guys have already turned up to support us and to keep this thing going, keeping it on the air and free, and helping us. I almost said line our pockets, like that's any kind of flattering phrasing. Help us pay the bills, because there are production costs associated with the show, and it takes a certain amount of time to produce, and it's just really nice to have you guys supporting us financially, as well as by listening every week. We know we've got great loyal listeners. So that about does it for us today. We're really looking forward to this weekend's card. We hope you guys enjoyed our breakdown of it. It's a fantastic event. At least TiVo it if you're not going to be able to watch it. Because, man, just prospects all over the place. Not every fight's necessarily going to be fun, but they're all fights that will have immediate or very near future relevance. And so I'm just really fascinated with a lot of these matchups. Pat, do you have anything you want to tell the people about before we sign off?
So I'm doing a couple of things this week. I will have a complete preview of this UFC Fight Night card that I hope you enjoy, and then I'll have a piece coming out later this week entitled "How Holly Holm Could Ruin Ronda Rousey for Mainstream Fans."
Oh, I'm fascinated by that, and I think I already know what your point is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to see Ronda Rousey keep flattening people? Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, that may not happen here.
Yeah, I mean she'll win, but it might be kind of gross.
Real ugly. Real ugly.
As for me,
doing,
I don't even know. Something about this card. I want to come up with something. I did a piece a few weeks back where it was like 3 kinds of counter to look for at this event. I want to come up with some kind of theme because there's so many. There aren't any like big name fights that stand out here, but there are so many fights that are little highlights unto themselves that I want to find a way to highlight some of the technical mastery we're going to see. You know, I got to talk about Rashid Magomedov, so at the very least, it's going to be something regarding him because I just love watching him perform.
Got to write about Tomas Almeida's disgustingly cool overhand counter elbow.
Sure.
Like, that is one of you. So I don't know that I've ever seen that strike thrown the way that he throws it in MMA.
Sure. That's actually quite a contender. I think I'll come up with something that involves, anything that involves both of those guys has got to be fun to write. And then I think coming out later this week, I'm going to have a piece on, also on Ronda Rousey and the success of women's MMA and how it highlights a need for change in the rules of women's boxing. Since I'm writing for that flowboxing.tv now. So
well, there you go.
You know, women only box for 2-minute rounds in boxing.
It's pretty messed up, man.
What's the point of that?
I don't get it.
They can't. It's too hard for them. Come on now. We've seen women fight for 5-minute rounds, 5-minute rounds even, and they do just fine. So let's stop being condescending, boxing people. Let's give the women the respect they deserve. And that's about it. Thank you guys for joining us. Pat, thank you for joining me for another very enjoyable episode. And if you guys came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.